Hey guys, Uncommon Ramen here. A few weeks back, I saw a couple of comments of people wanting to see the deck list for the full Umbris Fear Manifest deck, and I guess I totally forgot to post one of those, despite having posted a couple full deck lists of other decks that I was making. So here we go. This is going to be the deck list. But before I get into that, let me just say, if you like the video, please like and subscribe and hit that bell icon if you want to see more of my content when it releases. And also, if you feel the need to support me, hit me up on my Patreon at uncommonramen slash, I'm sorry, at patreon.com/uncommonramen, capital U, capital R. I do all this in my free time, so any amount of support I can get will help me bring more of this content to you. Also, as a disclaimer, again, when I built this deck, and I said this in the first video that I talked about, this was a deck that wasn't supposed to be run as Voltron. So Umbris itself, and if you don't know what Voltron is, basically means load down a single creature, usually your commander, with a ton of equipment and auras, and then swing in for commander damage to eliminate your opponents as quickly as possible. And Umbris is one of those creatures that just absolutely screams Voltron, because his own ability kind of makes him extremely buff very quickly, which means that you don't really even have to load him down with equipment as long as you include things like Whisper Silk Cloak, Rogue's Passage, other such things like that, because really what you're trying to do at this point is just make it unblockable, aqueous form, stuff like that, because his own ability is going to make him buff as it is. You're probably going to want to include things like Lightning Greaves and Swiftfoot Boots, just to make sure that he has some sort of protection, and because we're running black, you can also include things like Kaya's Ghost Form as well, or even Malakir Rebirth. But those are just things that you would run if you were running it as Voltron to keep Umbris alive and really swing in for some lethal damage with it. But again, since my concept for this deck was to just be straight up mill, my intention is to mill out all of my opponents, or come very close anyway. So I didn't want to build it as a straight up aggressive Voltron deck. I do use Umbris, but I use it in a very different kind of way. So without further ado, let's take a look. And we're going to start with the creatures. There are 20 creatures in here. Let me just separate those out and pull this off to the side. Starting with Dothy Voidwalker. Dothy Voidwalker exiles the cards that your opponents play immediately from their graveyard. So that couples with Umbris really well, because Umbris is looking for exiled cards, and that's what gives him his power. You can also alternatively sacrifice Dothy Voidwalker if you find one of those cards to be really powerful and synergistic with your strategy, to allow you to play that card for yourself. Next up, we have Doom Whisperer. Doom Whisperer is a nightmare, so Umbris sees it and it will trigger. But on top of that, it has Flying Trample. It's a 6/6, and you can pay 2 life to Surveil 2. So if you get stuck, this is a great way to unstuck you. And this deck is kind of notorious for getting stuck. Next up, we have Dream Eater. Dream Eater is a nightmare, so again, Umbris sees it and triggers. But beyond that, it has Flash, Flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you can Surveil 4, so you can unstuck yourself, and you can return target non-land permanent to an opponent controls to their hand. This is really great for spot removal, although it's a temporary spot removal. It helps pull something off the table to help open up your opponents, or just to get a certain threat off the table for a certain amount of time. You could even follow it up with a counter. I probably have counters in here. We'll see. Next up is Faceless Butcher. It is a nightmare horror. So on either end, Umbris sees it and will trigger. It is also a fantastic spot removal. So it's a body and a spot removal. The downside here is that whatever it does remove from the battlefield, if the Faceless Butcher dies, it just gets returned back to your opponent's side. So it has its upsides and its downsides. Honestly, I think it's a really great include. Plus, again, Umbris sees it, so it triggers. Next up, we have Grazilax, Illithid Scholar. It's a horror, so Umbris sees it. Whenever a creature you control becomes blocked, you can return it to your hand, which is really incredible for things that have ETB effects. So, for instance, the Dream Eater, and a couple other cards that we'll see in here, like the Ravenous Chupacabra. But really what it is for that reoccursion so that Umbris can see it again as it enters the battlefield. And then whenever one or more of your creatures deal combat damage to a player, you get to draw cards. So it's got a built-in draw card engine as well. So it's just a really great way to get a little bit more aggressive with this deck. And because it's a horror, it gets seen by Umbris. Next up, we have Heteron Crab. Heteron Crab is pretty simple, 0/2. If you hit landfall, mill 3 cards. And really, honestly, for a 1-cost creature, this is probably one of the best mills that I could put in this deck. Next up, we have Hullbreaker Horror. Hullbreaker Horror is a horror, so Umbra sees it. Has flash, it cannot be countered, and whenever you cast a spell, you can choose. Whenever you cast a spell, whenever you cast a spell, you can choose up to 1. Return target spell you don't control to its owner's hand, or return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. So it can act effectively as a sort of counter by bouncing a spell that's being played back to your opponent's hand. It can also act as a bounce, so very similar to the Dream Eater, only it can happen over and over again every time you cast a spell. So it's a very good card. It also is a 7/8 body, so it's just for control, extremely good. Next up, we have Mirko Vosk, Mind Drinker. I didn't see a lot of lists playing this, and I didn't quite understand why that was. Mirko Vosk, when he deals combat damage to a player, they have to reveal the top cards of the library until they reveal 4 lands. And then all of those lands, or all of those cards are put into the graveyard. So it's a phenomenal mill. But again, it's centric to being mill as opposed to being an aggressive Voltron deck. He's got flying, and while I won't say that he's completely unblockable, flying does tend to be a problem in Commander. So next up, we have Nemesis of Reason. Nemesis of Reason is a horror, so Umbris does see it, and whenever it attacks, it does not have to deal combat damage. Whenever it attacks, your opponent that it's attacking mills the top 10 cards of his or her library. And that's just a solid... It's a 3/7 body, so it's got a lot of survivability. It might not deal damage, but it doesn't have to deal damage. All it is right here is about milling those cards and doing it as heavily as possible. So 10 cards per attack, plus the Umbris trigger when it enters the battlefield. Just a solid card. Next up, we have Oblivion Sower. Oblivion Sower is an interesting card because while it does exile the top 4 cards of your opponent's library, which is great for Umbris, what it's really in here for is robbing your opponent of any lands that are in his exile. So itself is only milling 4 cards, but Umbris is going to mill quite a few cards, especially at the cost of 6. You're going to have cast Umbris at least once, and you could catch quite a few lands with this. So it's a great ramp spell on top of a mill spell. And it's a 5/8 body, which just makes it a really incredible card. Next up, we have Una, Queen of the Fae. Una, the Queen of the Fae, is a great mill for X and a blue or black. You can choose a color, and then target opponent exiles the top X cards of the library. And then for each card that they mill of the color you chose, you get to create a blue-black fairy with a 1/1 blue-black fairy with flying. And that is just a great way to throw up a wall of chump blockers while still getting the mill. And it comes on a 5/5 flying body, so it's not as if she couldn't do damage herself if you decide to get aggressive with it. So Una, Queen of the Fae, very good card. Next up, we have Phyrexian Revoker. When it enters the play, you choose a non-land card name, and activated abilities or sources with the chosen name can't be activated. So essentially what we're doing is locking out a single card with activated abilities. Now, that isn't necessarily going to lock out a threat. A big body is still going to be able to swing in, but if something has an activated ability that is just downright oppressive, this effectively erases that. So it's just a great way to kind of keep yourself somewhat safe. Not to mention, it is a horror, so Umbris does see it as a trigger. This one I may end up still pulling out for something like Spellskite. Spellskite absorbs a spell that's targeting something else. So if you play your Umbris and you have a Spellskite in play and your opponents try to kill the Umbris, you can have Spellskite pretty much absorb that. And Spellskite on top of that, I believe, is a nightmare or a horror. So therefore, it still triggers Umbris. So I think that this one's tentative. I'm not really sure if I'm going to keep this one in there. But if I do remove it, it's just going to get removed for Spellskite. Next up, we have Ravenous Chupacabra. Ravenous Chupacabra is a horror, so it sees, or Umbra sees it and triggers. But on top of that, it's a 2/2 body that when it enters the battlefield, you destroy target creature and opponent controls. So it's just downright removal, and it can take out some of those bigger threats that are causing you problems. So yeah, just a solid card. Next up, we have Rune Crab. If we have Heteron Crab, we need to have Rune Crab. Rune Crab is the same thing. It has one more toughness, I believe, than Heteron Crab, but its landfall ability is exactly the same. Mill 3 cards. Next up, we have Shadowkin. Shadowkin's a shapeshifter. At the beginning of your upkeep, each player mills 3 cards, and then you can exile a creature card from among those cards. And if you do, Shadowkin becomes a copy of that card, except it has this ability. So every turn, let me see. Yeah, at every upkeep, it's milling your opponents for 3 cards. So that's fantastic. It's exiling at least one of those cards, which is great for Umbris. And then it's turning into that card, and it still retains the ability. So next upkeep, it's just going to do it over and over again. It's just a really solid card to have in here. And it can mimic a big body. It can mimic something that's oppressive. It's really very versatile. Next up, we have Sire of Stagnation. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, that player exiles the top 2 cards of his or her library, and then you draw 2 cards. So it's a draw card engine. It's an exile card, and basically a mill, but exiles, which is great for Umbris. And it's a 5/7 body, so it's just a really solid hit for this deck. Next up, we have Sludge Monster. When Sludge Monster enters the battlefield or attacks, put a slime counter on up to 1 target creature. Non-horror creatures with a slime counter on them lose all abilities and have a base power and toughness of 2/2. So there's a couple reasons why this is in here. First off, it's a horror, so Umbris sees it and triggers. Secondly, the slime counters, because the slime counters essentially blank a creature and turn it into a 2/2. Which for big threats, and probably one of the biggest weaknesses of this deck is big threats. This basically nullifies those big threats. And it does it every time it enters the battlefield or every time it attacks. So it has Grazlax synergies, and it has just its own synergies from attacking. So it's a great way to blank out the big threats that are really putting a lot of pressure on you, because when you start milling people for their cards, they start looking at you as a primary target. Next up, we have Thing in the Ice. So Thing in the Ice is a 0/4 defender. It enters the battlefield with 4 ice counters, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you can remove an ice counter from it. And when it has no more ice counters, it transforms, and it effectively transforms into a board wipe in a sense. It transforms into a Kraken Horror, which Umbris will see. And when this creature transforms into a Woken Horror, return all non-horror creatures to their owner's hands. So basically, if you're playing all of your horrors, you're essentially going to wipe the field of anything but your own creatures, and that could be game at that point. It's a very good selective board wipe, if you will. And because it's a 7/8 body, it's just really good. Thing in the Ice itself is a horror. So Umbris will see it when it enters the battlefield. Oops. Yeah. Next up, we have Toxrill. Now, Toxrill is the other big reason that I run Sludge Monster. So at the beginning of each end step, put a slime counter on each creature you don't control. If you have Sludge Monster in play, that means now all of those creatures that you don't control just became blank 2/2s. So they all become vanilla 2/2s. It is effectively ruining the board for your opponents, and the 2 of them synergize super well. The other part of it is creatures that you don't control get a -1 or get -1/-1 for each slime counter on them. So you can continuously stack counters on them. And since they all have a base toughness of 2/2 if Sludge Monster is in play, then essentially after you've stacked a second slime counter on them, they all die. So it can effectively work out like a slow board wipe. And then last but not least, whenever a creature you don't control with a slime counter on it dies, create a 1/1 black slug creature token. So again, like Una, you're going to create after you've put the sludge monster in play and put out that second slime counter. You're going to create effectively a bunch of little 1/1 slugs that can be used as chump blockers, or you can use his ability for 1 blue and 1 black to sacrifice the slug to draw a card. So you have options with this card. And again, one of the biggest weaknesses for this deck is big scary threats and getting stuck because your deck is just not, I don't know how to say it. The lands for some reason just don't like coming to you. And then the last of the creatures we have is Woe Strider. It's a horror, so Umbris sees it and will trigger. Same, by the way, with Toxtril is a horror, so Umbris will trigger. It's a horror. When it enters the battlefield, you get a 0/1 goat, and you can sacrifice a creature to scry one. So you can sacrifice that goat, you can sacrifice some slugs, you can sacrifice fairies, you can even sacrifice the horrors that you've put into play if it becomes necessary to scry. Because again, the scrying is to help you get unstuck. You can also escape with this card. For 3 and 2 black, exile 4 other cards from your graveyard, and then Woe Strider escapes with 2+1/+1 counters on it, becoming a 5/4, which is a really decent body. But again, it's not about being aggressive with this deck. What we're really trying to do here is just mill out the opponents as quickly as possible. So with that, we're going to go into the instants. And there were only 5 instants. A lot of the milling cards, the big mill cards, are sorceries, so you have to do it on your turn. So again, if we stack weaknesses on this deck, it's kind of slow. There's not a lot in the instant speed. So the first thing we have is Drown in Dreams. Drown in Dreams is meant to be a kill spell. Okay, so if you mill an opponent enough and they only have a few cards left and you don't have an effective way of milling them, Drown in Dreams can kill them. You just target player draws X cards. When they can't draw anymore, they lose. You can also effectively target player mills twice X cards, so either way, it kind of works in that kill spell type of way. You can also use the draw card for yourself, so if you're in a desperate situation, you can spend the Drown in Dreams to help yourself draw cards. Next up, we have Eat to Extinction. Exile target creature or planeswalker. Look at the top card of your library, and you may put that card into your graveyard. So again, if you're stuck, it just kind of helps unstuck you, and it gets creatures or planeswalkers. We've got Zot's Will. Choose one, and if you control your commander, you can choose both. And essentially, the first one is each opponent sacrifices a creature, then sacrifices a creature that they control with the greatest power. And then the other one is exile all cards from your opponent's graveyard, and then create X01 black Thrall creature tokens, where X is the greatest power among creature cards you exiled this way. So you're exiling graveyards, which is fantastic because, again, Umbris works on exiled cards, not cards in graveyards. And then you're creating X01 Thrall tokens that you can sacrifice to the Woe Strider. You could use as chump blockers, you name it. Next up, we have Vampiric Tutor. So we can basically unstuck ourselves if we need a specific card, especially if we need to find a kill spell. This is what we use. And then last of the instants, we have Vraska's Contempt. Exile target creature or planeswalker, and then you gain 2 life. So another removal spell, specifically targeting creatures or planeswalkers. Just a great versatile removal spell. All right, next we move into the sorceries. We start with Essence Harvest. Essence Harvest was meant to also be a kill spell, an game ending kill spell. So target player loses X life and you gain X life, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. So the idea here is to exile your opponent's graveyards, make Umbris huge, bring Umbris out, then use the Essence Harvest to kill a player that you're playing against. Next up, we have Fractured Sanity. Each opponent mills 14 cards for 3 blue. So first off, it costs 3 blue, and each opponent mills 14 cards. So if you're playing against 3 players, that's what, 30, 42 cards? 42 cards that you're milling. You can also, alternatively, for 1 and a blue, cycle it. which allows you to draw cards, so you could unstuck yourself if that is necessary, and each opponent mills 4 cards, so you're catching 12 cards at that point. Either way, you're milling cards. It's just a very versatile card, and I think that it's just the fact that it can hit each opponent is very powerful. Next up, we have Life's Finale. Destroy all creatures, then search target opponent's library for up to 3 creature cards and put them into his or her graveyard. Then that player shuffles his or her library. So not only are we getting a nice little board wipe, but one of your opponents is getting milled, and you're actually choosing what they're milling at that point. So even though it's only 3, the real power here is that we're also board wiping. So it's just a really cool board wipe. Next up, we have Maddening Cacophony. Each player mills 8 cards. However, if you pay the kicker cost, instead each opponent mills half their library rounded up. So it is effectively a better Traumatize. I think it costs 1 more than Traumatize costs, but if you pay the kick, I'm assuming you pay the kicker. If you pay the kicker, I think it costs 1 more than Traumatize costs, and as I mentioned, it hits each opponent and it mills half their library. If you can cast that spell, then you effectively have a much easier job when it comes to milling the rest of the cards. I just think it's a phenomenal card to have. Then we have Mind Funeral. Mind Funeral says target opponent reveals cards from the top of his or her library until 4 land cards are revealed. That player puts all those cards into his or her graveyard. Mind Funeral is the sorcery version of Mirko Vosk. And again, it sees 4 lands before putting everything into the graveyard. So it's just a much, I guess, heavier mill than something like Umbris. Next up, we have Mind Grind. You pay X, and then X, a blue and a black. Each opponent, and again, this is each opponent, reveals cards from the top of his or her library until he or she reveals X land cards, then puts all of those cards revealed this way into his or her graveyard. And so, essentially, Mind Funeral says 1 opponent and only 4 lands. Mind Grind hits all opponents and can be up to, any number of lands. It depends on how much you put into it, but it can be very devastating. Not only are you milling the cards, but you're milling however many lands too, which most decks want lands, so it's not a good thing. Next up, we have Nightmare Incursion. Nightmare Incursion was one of those, as I was playing the deck a couple of times, I realized that there were certain cards that I just could not let my opponent have. And so Nightmare Incursion lets you search target player's library for up to X cards, where X is the number of swamps you control, and remove them from the game. Then that player shuffles his or her library. So what you're trying to do here is it effectively works like a mill. You want to mill out the cards that are going to make their deck work, and if essentially put them in a position where they kind of become less effective, if effective at all. Next up, we have Rite of Replication. So Rite of Replication is another one of those game-winning spells. It's in here to win the game. And the reason is because of Umbris. So you use Rite of Replication on Umbris. And yes, that does mean that essentially by the time you're done with it, all of your Umbrises are dead because they are legends. But before they die, they see each other. And since they are all Nightmare Horrors, they see all instants of that. So if you pay the kicker cost on this, you get to put 5 tokens that are copies of whatever you chose. So in this case, Umbris, right? So that means each Umbris is seeing 5 other Umbrises come into play. And so they are all going to trigger 5 times. So 5 times 5 is 25. That's 25 triggers of Umbris. And that are actually 5 times. Yeah. Well, there's actually going to be 6. 5 times 6. That's 30 triggers of Umbris happening before the Umbrises die, essentially. And since Umbris is your commander, it dying just means that you have to pay the commander tax. That can suck, but if this shuts out the game or brings it very devastatingly close to shutting out the game, then it kind of doesn't matter. And with 30 triggers, it's a target opponent thing, so you get to pick who gets hit by each of those triggers. So if you think that you can handle a person who only has 10 more cards left in their library, you can immediately focus on somebody else. And so it's nothing to sneeze at. Rite of Replication is a darn good card in this and can definitely shut out the game in the right situations. Next up, we have Sadistic Sacrament. You can search your library search your opponent's library or target player's library for up to 3 cards and exile them. Or if you kick it, you can instead search their library for up to 15 cards and remove it. So it is in here for the same reason as Nightmare Incursion. This one is going to mill 15 cards, but you get to choose which 15 cards get milled. So you can effectively pretty much destroy an opponent's deck doing that. 15 cards removed, if you pick the right 15 cards, could pretty much take all the win conditions or even board wipes out of your opponent's deck completely. Next up, we have Startled Awake. Startled Awake says target opponent puts the top 13 cards of his or her library into the graveyard, and then if you pay 3 and 2 blue while Startled Awake is in the graveyard, you can return to the battlefield transformed. And the reason this is so good is because his transformed version has Skulk, so he can't be blocked with creatures that have greater power. He's a 1/1, so the only thing that can block him is a 1/1. And whenever he deals combat damage to a player, you can return it to your hand and recast Startled Awake. So he just continuously reoccurs himself. And the Persistent Nightmare, which is the creature, is a nightmare. So it will trigger Umbris if Umbris is in play. So it's just a darn good card to continuously reoccur and really cause problems for your opponents. Next up, we have Tasha's Hideous Laughter. For 3, you get to each opponent exiles cards from the top of their library until they exile cards with a total mana value of 20 or more. So if your opponent's playing, big mana, big creatures, that probably means you're not going to mill too much. But if your opponents are playing like typical decks, you could mill quite a bit out of their deck before you hit that 20 mana value or more. It's just a really good spell. More importantly, again, like I've been pointing out with a lot of these cards, it says each opponent, not just target opponent. Next up, we have Traumatize. If we're going to run Maddening Cacophony, we should probably run Traumatize too. Traumatize just says target player puts the top half of his or her library rounded down into his or her graveyard. So it mills half your deck. This one's rounded down and it targets a player as opposed to each opponent. But it's still really good for getting that one player really close to dead. Lastly, we have Whispering Madness, and it was between this or Windfall. And Whispering Madness won out because of Cypher. Whispering Madness and Windfall are about the same thing. Each player is going to discard their entire hand, and then everyone is going to draw cards equal to the person who had the most cards in hand, right? Greatest number of cards a player discard this way, yeah. So you're going to discard your cards and redraw a hand. But the big thing here is that it has Cypher. So after it has been resolved, it will attach itself to a creature, and whenever that creature deals combat damage, it will cast itself for free. And that is, in my opinion, really effective mill. Yes, you're putting it into your opponent's hand, but then the next turn they're discarding that hand and drawing a new hand, and then the next turn they're discarding that hand and drawing a new hand. So it's kind of like milling, but also giving your opponents options. It's a little scary, but I think it's necessary. So that's it for the sorceries. Next, we're going to look at artifacts, and the artifacts are pretty self-explanatory for the most part, because we have rocks in here. We have Arcane Signet, 2 to tap for color identity. Crumbling Sanctuary, for each 1 damage that would be dealt to a player, that player removes the top card of his or her library instead. So all of the damage that you're dealing effectively turns into mill instead, which is what I want to do with this deck. Dimir Signet, you 2 for a filter, basically, for one blue and 1 black. Felwar Stone, 2 to tap for a color that your opponent's lands can produce. Maskwood Nexus. So Maskwood Nexus is in here because there are quite a few creatures in here that aren't horrors or nightmares, and it essentially makes it so that if you have Maskwood Nexus in play and then you play one of those creatures, Umbris will see it and trigger. Plus, it creates little 2/2 blue shapeshifters with Changeling, which means that when those enter the play, Umbris will see it as well. We got Mesmeric Orb. Now, Mesmeric Orb is one of those cards that when I had it in here the first time, I ended up taking it out of my deck because it mills me too. But after getting stuck with this deck on multiple occasions, I realized that maybe me getting milled isn't such a bad idea because me getting milled also technically unstucks me. So this card is in here because first off, whenever a permanent becomes untapped, that permanent's controller mills a card. So every time your opponent untaps their lands, they're going to mill that many cards. Every time they untap their creatures, they're going to mill that many cards. Every time they untap their mana rocks, they're going to mill that many cards. It's just a really super effective way to mill your opponents, but it also mills you, which means that if you're really, really stuck, this could help. Next up, we have Mind Crank. It says whenever an opponent loses life, that player puts that many cards from the top of his or her library into his or graveyard. So it's very similar to Crumbling Sanctuary. Crumbling Sanctuary replaces damage from mill. This one doesn't replace the damage. Your opponent's still going to lose the life, but they're also going to mill the cards. So it's effectively better than Crumbling Sanctuary, and it costs less than Crumbling Sanctuary. So it needs to be in here. Next up, we have Panharmonicon. So this one is doubling all triggered abilities. So Mind Crank would double, Mesmeric Orb would double, Crumbling Sanctuary would double, Umbris would double, I believe Whispering Madness, when it's ciphered, would double because I think it becomes a triggered ability at that point. Might be wrong on that. But essentially what you're trying to do is double all of those abilities that mill cards. So yeah, Panharmonicon. Shadow Spear. Shadow Spear is just good. Let's say your opponent has a hexproof or indestructible creature. This deck has a very hard time dealing with that kind of stuff. So Shadow Spear helps to get rid of that. Plus, it gives +1/+1, gives trample and lifelink. So if you do end up throwing it onto Umbris, it kind of effectively does become that Tron or Voltron deck. I did put it in here because obviously, as far as the alternative win condition of milling my opponents, that's not always going to be effective. Most importantly, if you have 3 opponents, you may effectively mill out 1, maybe even 2 of them, but by that point in time, your final opponent is going to be so dead set on getting rid of you that you might have to focus on the idea of getting that Umbris in there for lethal. Next up, we have Sol Ring, 1 for 2. Soul Guide Lantern. When it enters the battlefield, exile target card from a graveyard. You can also sacrifice it to exile each opponent's graveyard. So that's what it's in here for. You're basically sacrificing it to exile each opponent's graveyard. Therefore, the next time you cast Umbris, he is that much bigger. Next up, we have Swiftfoot Boots. Same thing that I mentioned earlier. Swiftfoot Boots protects Umbris. Makes him untargetable from my opponent. Gives him haste, so it makes him dangerous. Then we have Sword of Hearth and Home. Sword of Hearth and Home does a couple things here. The first of which gives the +2/+2 protection from green and white, which means that if you're playing somebody who's playing green or white, Umbris can be very scary. But more importantly, when the creature deals combat damage, you can exile the creature and search your library for a basic land card and put both back into play. So this is good because A, you're ramping, and blue-black doesn't have a lot in the way of ramp. And B, you're getting that blink effect. So anything that ETBs, like Umbris or any numerous amount of creatures that I have with ETBs, that ETB will happen again. Next up, we have Talisman of Dominance. You can tap it for colorless, or you can tap it for blue-black if you take a damage. Then we have Thought Vessel. 2 for 1, but it also effectively means you don't have a maximum hand size. I don't know if that's necessary. It depends on how much you're drawing. Really, we're milling, not drawing, so I just put it in there just in case. Okay, next we're going to look at enchantments, and there are several of these. Starting with Court of Cunning. Court of Cunning at the beginning of your upkeep. Any number of target players each are going to mill 2 cards, so you can choose that. But if you're the Monarch, they're going to mill 10 cards instead. So at the very beginning, as long as you can hold on to the Monarch, you're milling quite a bit of cards. However, even if you do lose the Monarch, you're still going to mill at least 2 cards. So it's still effectively milling each upkeep, just it's more effective if you are the Monarch. Next up, we have Leyline of the Void. Leyline of the Void is in here because instead of something like Planar Void, because it only affects your opponent's graveyards. If a card would be put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead, which is great for Umbris. Since I need my cards generally because I have certain recursion spells, I kind of don't want my cards to be exiled. So I did not put Planar Void in here. Leyline of the Void also can be put onto the battlefield at the very beginning of the game if it starts in your starting hand. So it's just a really great card. Next up, we have Memory Erosion. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, that player puts the top 2 cards of the library into their graveyard. So you penalize them for casting spells, which is effectively milling them as well. Then we have Mind's Dilation. Whenever an opponent casts his or her first spell each turn, that player exiles the top card of his or her library. And if it's an online card, you can play it without paying its mana cost. This is a sneaky and potentially devastating enchantment because you can catch some really powerful cards from your opponents. And, you know, obviously throughout the course of the game, you're probably not going to catch the really powerful ones, but that still allows you to put creatures into play. It still allows you to put their rocks into play. It still allows you to cast their ramp spells. It's just a really sneaky, powerful card. Next up, we have Phyrexian Scriptures. It is meant to be a board wipe. You put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, and that creature becomes an artifact in addition to its other types. Then, as its second step, you destroy all non-artifact creatures, and then as final step, you exile all cards from all opponents' graveyards. So not only are you wiping the board, but you're also exiling the cards from their graveyard, which Umbris cares about. More importantly, you're putting that +1/+1 counter, you can throw that onto Umbris, turn him into artifact, and he'll be the one creature that doesn't die when the second part of Phyrexian Scriptures happens. So it's just a really effective card for this deck. Next up, we have Psychic Corrosion. Whenever you draw a card, each opponent puts the top 2 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. So if you end up casting the... what was the name of that spell? The X2 and a blue to draw either draw cards or mill twice X cards, you could target yourself to draw the cards and still manage to mill your opponents for twice X because they mill 2 cards every time you draw a card. Web of Inertia. At the beginning of each opponent's combat phase, that player may remove a card from his or her graveyard from the game. If that player doesn't, creatures he or she controls can't attack this turn. So it doubles in the fact that you're removing cards from their graveyard. So Umbris likes that. But more importantly, if you've gotten one of your many spells that remove all opponents' graveyards from the game, they won't have a card to remove from the game. And so therefore, they won't be able to attack. So it can be really good at protecting you. And that was the last of the enchantments. Next, we're going to look at the Planeswalkers. And I might be taking this down a little bit because we actually have 3 Planeswalkers in here, but they might not all be necessary. We could probably use some of that for maybe counter spells or stuff like that. But starting with Ashiok Dream Render. So Ashiok Dream Render basically says your opponents can't search their library. So that shuts down ramp spells and it shuts down tutor spells, which can be really detrimental to this deck because it has so many weaknesses. But the biggest part here is for -1, target player puts the top 4 cards of their library into their graveyard, then exile each opponent's graveyard. The exile each opponent's graveyard is so important for this card. So essentially, not only are you going to mill one of your opponents, but now you've made Umbris even bigger. And you've kind of wrung out the options that your opponent has. Next, we have Ashiok Nightmare Muse. Ashiok Nightmare Muse is cool because it can protect itself. For one uptick, you can create a 2/3 blue and black Nightmare creature token that says whenever this creature attacks or blocks, each opponent exiles the top 2 cards of his or her library. It's a nightmare, or is it just nightmare? Yeah, it's a nightmare, so Umbris sees it. If it blocks or attacks, it mills 2 cards. Obviously, being a 2/3 body, you can use it to protect Ashiok Nightmare Muse, which will effectively mill your opponents, but also the Nightmare trigger. For -3, you can return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. Then that player exiles a card from their hand. So again, we're exiling again. And then finally, for his ultimate, you can cast up to 3 face-up cards from your opponent's that your opponents own from exile without paying their mana cost. So essentially, as the ultimate, you can take 3 of their worst cards and cast them without paying their mana cost. And that's just incredible. And they're going to have a lot exiled. That's the whole point of this deck. Lastly, we have Ashiok Nightmare Weaver. Yes, yet another Ashiok. For +2, exile the top 3 cards of target opponent's library. So just a solid mill. For -X, put a creature card with converted mana cost X, exiled with Ashiok Nightmare Weaver, onto the battlefield under your control. That creature is a nightmare in addition to its other types, so that would trigger Umbris, and it protects Ashiok. Plus, it could take a potentially large threat from your opponent and put it on your side. And then 10, exile. For -10, exile all cards from all opponents' hands and graveyards. The hands part is the big part here. If your opponent has no hand, they have no resources. They immediately move into top deck mode, and that's where you want them. You want them in top deck mode. The less answers they have, the better survivability you have. So there you go. We have Ashiok Nightmare Weaver. Lastly, we're going to take a look at the land base here, and the land base is unusual, and I'll explain some of that. Got the Bojuka Bog for the exile. You exile target player's library or graveyard, and Umbris sees that, so it just makes him bigger. Castle Locktwain enters untapped if you control a swamp, and for 1 and 2 black and you can draw a card, then lose life equal to the number of cards in your hand. So if you're in a desperate situation, this is a great way to get cards in your hand. Got Castle Vantress for 2 and 2 blue, and you can scry 2, so you can unstuck yourself if you feel like you're stuck, which happens a lot. And it comes into play untapped if you control an island. We have Choked Estuary. Enters the battlefield tapped unless you reveal an island or swamp from your hand, but it taps for blue-black. We have Command Beacon. Command Beacon you can sacrifice to put your commander into your hand from your command zone. As I mentioned before, Umbris kind of makes himself a target. So if your opponents can kill it, they tend to kill it, which means that over time, he's going to become way harder to cast. So Command Beacon is in here so you can pop him back to your hand and cast him for his normal cost as opposed to the taxed cost. It's just an alternative way to save yourself that trouble. We have Command Tower because you have to. Darkwater Catacombs is essentially the same thing as the Dimir Signet, except it, doesn't have to be paid for. We have Dimir Aqueduct, the bounce land for blue-black. Drowned Catacombs comes into play tapped unless you control an island or swamp, taps for blue-black. Exotic Orchard, because again, if you're playing a 4-player game, at least one of your opponents is bound to have a mana of your type. We have Evolving Wilds to search for something. We have Fabled Passage to do the same thing. Field of Ruin. If there is just an absolute downright, like this is meant to be in here for like Gaia's Cradle, Growing Rights of Itlamok, that Eternal Land, anything that causes some serious problems in the non-basic area, you could get rid of it and force your opponent to take a basic land instead. Hostile. I don't know why I have this in here. It's a creature land. I think that's the biggest reason, because it turns into a 3/7 and gets bigger. But it doesn't have huge synergies. I think it's really just in here because it can become a 3/7 body, and this deck has such a hard time with keeping the field in your favor. We have Ice Tunnel. Ice Tunnel is in here because it counts as an island and a swamp. It's also Snowland, but that doesn't really matter to me. It enters tapped, unfortunately, but again, counts as an island or swamp. Mystic Sanctuary. Mystic Sanctuary is in here because it counts as an island, but also because you can, if you have 3 or more islands, in play, you can return a instant or sorcery from your graveyard to your hand, so you can recur some of those really powerful mill spells. Nephalia Drownyard, because for 1, a blue and a black, and you can target a player and make them mill 3 cards. It's just another way to mill cards. Path of Ancestry, for obvious reasons. We get that scry, plus it taps for any color. Reliquary Tower, no maximum hand size, just in case it matters. Shipwreck Marsh, enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or more other lands, taps for blue-black. Sunken Hollow, counts as an island or swamp, enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or more basic lands. Tainted Isle, taps for blue and black if you control a swamp. Temple of Deceit, Scryland. It's not the worst thing in the world. Temple of False Gods, we can get some extra mana. And Watery Grave, because it counts as an island, swamp, and enters the battlefield tapped unless you pay 2 life. Shock lands. And last, we have our basic lands. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 islands, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 swamps. So that is the Umbrisphere Manifest in its current iteration. I've played it, I think, 4 or 5 times here, and I've reiterated it each time because of one reason or another. It's had things like Phoenix in it. Phoenix didn't work out because I could never get the devotion that I needed to make him a creature, and in order for him to be super effective, because he has a 7 toughness, he himself needs to be a creature so that you can tap him to mill your opponents for 7. I also ended up taking out quite a few different horrors and nightmares, depending on what they were, just because they just weren't effective enough. I had one in here, I think it was called Eternal Scourge, which you could cast from exile, but the thing is that I'm not doing a whole lot of exiling myself, so it didn't make a huge difference. And when he was just in the graveyard, he was completely useless to me. I took out Icarid from here because I wasn't seeing enough recursion from it. There just wasn't a lot of black creatures going into my graveyard. And the ones that were in there, I kind of needed as recursion, so it just didn't end up being effective. I took out things like Consuming Aberration, although I do want to put it back in here. Consuming Aberration is effective if your opponent's graveyards aren't exiled. And since your ultimate plan is to exile your opponent's graveyards, it eventually get killed because your opponents don't have any graveyard. But over time, this deck has evolved several times. This is the current iteration. I have not had a chance to play test it in its current situation. But again, like I said, the disclaimer here is that I meant for it to be heavy mill, and that's it. Not supposed to be Voltron, not supposed to be aggressive. And because of that, it has several weaknesses that I've tried to address, but I don't think they're effectively addressed. And more importantly, if you become the arch nemesis, which generally tends to happen with this deck, 3 opponents teaming up on you pretty much guarantees you're going to lose the game. So just keep that in mind. Anyway, that is the Umbris Mill deck. And that's basically it. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down below. But as a reminder, please keep all of these positive. I will be removing any negative comments from my videos. And until next time, guys. Peace.